Hey y'all, I hope you're doing well in these times. Art appreciation. I hope as well your midterm, your exam went well. And you have plenty of time to get it finalized. So first, yeah, I just want to say that I hope you all and your families and everyone that you're with at this time are doing well and you're safe and just keep helping each other out as much as you can. It's about all we can do. That's about as essential as we can be at this moment. So with this video, I just want to briefly summarize the next thing that we're going to touch base on, which is printmaking. And I will be uploading the PowerPoint onto Blackboard so you have access. I'm going to go over a few specific areas in the PowerPoint, just like I always have done before. I don't go over the entire PowerPoint, just select areas to emphasize. And I'll also be putting some assessment questions or just an assignment up on Blackboard to have finished by the end of the week, at the end of the weekend, as a grading scale to kind of let you know where you stand in the overall makeup of the PowerPoint as well as the class. And they'll all be geared directly towards the PowerPoint. You'll be able to find the answers in the PowerPoint as well as using some critical thinking. I'm going to have a few questions that are going to be graded based off of critical thinking and focusing on doing it and trying to create some kind of response that makes you think on how we're collectively learning, like the design principles, the visual elements, and all the different medium, and to make it all coalesce so that by the end of this semester, again, you'll have an appreciation in a way to define and best explain how the visual arts works and how to appreciate it, hence art appreciation. So what I'm going to talk about specifically with the printmaking PowerPoint is relief printmaking as well as intaglio. Relief printmaking and intaglio are the two main types, two main processes. And relief is specifically geared towards the use of wood. Okay, so woodcuts is what they would be called, woodcuts. And what happens in this process is you take a specific type of wood that's used, often a soft piece of wood, so it's not so difficult to carve into, using carving tools. And with these carving tools, you remove an area on the wood, and that area is going to be the place where the ink is not applied. Anywhere where you do not remove the wood is where the ink is applied, okay? And the paper is placed on top. There's a compression unit that goes on the top of the paper, a roller typically, and then that's where it transfers over onto the paper. So this is when we're coming back to that positive and negative space and shapes. So where you're carving in, and remember it's going to be the inverse. So if you're looking at the piece of wood and you want the image on the paper to be facing towards the right, then you have to do the opposite. You have to have it carved in a way where it's facing towards the left on the wood. The paper goes on, the inverse reflected image is present on the paper when it's removed from the wood cut. Okay? That's how printmaking works. It has to be reversed. Everything has to be reversed, like a mirror. So where you carve into the wood is what will become the negative space on the wood, but will become the positive image, right, on the paper where there's no ink. So then it would be the opposite, where the positive, where the ink's going to be laid on the wood, where you don't carve, it's going to be flipped, and that's going to become the negative, or like the shadows, so to speak, if we're talking about value. I keep looking this way because that's where the video is of my face, so I'll try to look more straight. So, So again, where you don't carve on the wood and the image and the ink goes onto that wood and then is transferred, this is a transferring process, onto the paper, that's going to become the negative on the paper. So where your shadows are is what's going to be positive on the wood, and it will look like the shadows on the paper, okay? And again, the PowerPoint will really kind of break down this process. There's really great diagrams to show you the relief process as well as the linoleum. Um, Linoleum is specifically used for the intaglio. Okay, so the intaglio is the opposite, and I'll talk about that here in just a minute. But what I want to emphasize are a couple of pieces in particular. One by Hiroshige, and it's the Light Rain at Shono, and explain how the registrations work. So for this wood block, it's a colored wood block. It's not black and white. It's colored ink. Is there are multiple layers involved. There's the, remember we talked about atmospheric perspective and how the detail and the color hue becomes more diminished and less specific or less defined as you move away from the foreground. You start getting into the background. That's how atmospheric or aerial perspective works. And with this print by Hiroshige, you see that there's faded foliage or faded bushes or trees in the background, right? Where it's really of a light gray scale. And that is the first application or the first wood block that's used. When you see this piece, I don't want you to think that the whole image is on one wood block. It's multiple wood blocks layered in a way to build up this composition. Okay, I don't know if any of you know about the old Disney films, but they would layer up the images to give, it's a very subtle three-dimensional layering of images to create the depth. And this is multiple wood blocks used with the colored ink to give this depth. So when you're looking at the image, you look all the way in the background and you see these faded gray trees. That's the first wood block. That's just the carved trees. Then you can see where the trees are getting a little darker in the middle ground. That would be the next wood block, just specifically for those dark trees. No figures carved in, nothing. And that gray, that darker gray block has to line up in the parameters or what are called the registrations of the first wood block that was used to make the lighter, more subtle trees that are in the far background. Okay? Then it layers from that point to the next wood block, which will be the environment or the figures and the architecture that we see with the roofs of the shelters. Okay, that would be the next layer, the next level. And I might be missing one or two levels. I'm not a professional printmaker, but this is from what I see. Then you have the kind of green foliage that looks like it's coming up over one of the figures with an umbrella, right? That would be the next layer. And remember, all these are specific to just um, those shapes and those designs. Then the last is the wash of what looks like rain coming up over the whole environment, right? So what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 5 or 6 layers. And then the stamp as well, and the signature in Mandarin is also, the stamp itself is also a wood block. And then the Mandarin, the characters are, I believe, placed on there with the ink, with a brush. So that's how the layering works with this relief woodcut, all right, the wood block. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So now we'll look at the lino cut or linoleum cut. Linoleum cut with relief. The linoleum is way more forgiving. If you think about, if you're carving into wood, what do you have? You have splintering possibilities. You also have the chance of you have to rip or cut against the grain, which can be more resistant. So the definition on trying to get a print on a wood block can be very challenging. A more contemporary synthetic approach is the use of linoleum. And there are linoleum cutters that are used to cut into the linoleum. It's really soft, almost as soft as butter. It's like a denser rubber that allows the cut to be nice and smooth and graceful. You can get more detail and more texture with the linoleum. Okay, so let me see which one I had. I had catlets. I have special reservations. Let me get to it real quick. Sorry. I have special reservations. Yeah. Okay. So this is let me make sure I have this right. Yeah. So again, I just want to emphasize the linoleum cut real quick. It's an even cut with gouges. Again, you're gouging into it. Um, so I just really want to emphasize that more than anything. Now, with a Catlett's piece, this is a great example of art functioning as commentary. All right, and also showing dignified images and prominent African American figures in history, and this one in particular. So you can see with Catlets, just to talk about the technique real quick before talking about the commentary, is where you see the white highlights, that again is where you've carved into the linoleum, and where you see the darker lines or the black lines, that's where the ink has laid on the surface of linoleum and it hasn't gone into the grooves or the gouges that you've cut. So again, it transfers over. So where you see it's black or gray on the actual print by Catlett, that is where the ink laid on the surface. And where you see the white highlights of this print, that's where Catlett has carved deep into linoleum, where the ink does not rest and it does not lay. All right. Now, the social commentary is obviously showing the importance of these dignified figures in the African American cultures, where they have become these harbingers of social change. And Cat Elizabeth is taking the opportunity to use the prints to distribute amongst the masses and distribute amongst the middle class in particular, because printmaking was a great way to start collecting art as a middle class citizen. And if you have it in your home, it becomes a topic of conversation to keep revolutionizing, to keep creating a talking dialogue using prints or using visual arts. They can be easily handed out, easily distributed. The prices of the prints themselves are astronomically lower than, let's say, a fine painting, a fine art painting, or a sculpture, which could be thousands and thousands of dollars. Prints can, range in the low $100, or even less than that at this time in the 1940s, where people could have them available. Okay, so again, using art as commentary to really explain the importance of social change, and the requirement for equality, and the placement of everybody on an equal level. And that's what Catlett did very well, and these linoleum cuts, or these lino cuts, are great examples of that. Okay. Now, something a little more contemporary is Romero's cities on the move, which is ciudades que se van. All right, so cities on the move, and this is the same process, but it's using old tires that have not been used for a while, and they're being reused. And he's cut into the tires. Okay, and again, this is a relief style. He's cut into the tires, and then he's put ink around where he's cut, not into the grooves, but around where he's cut. And then he's rolled these tires, because tires, as you know, can be heavy. He's rolled these tires as they've been inked over this long sheet of paper, okay, or I'm sorry, fabric. Okay, so this fabric. So what he's carved into the tires is being transferred, excuse me, transferred over onto this fabric. All right, so it's a very contemporary approach. It's not only presenting the prints, but it's also presenting the um, the mechanisms used to make the prints, like the tires. What's the significance of the tires? How do they relate to the concept cities on the move? Right, it's four tires. Most of our vehicles have four wheels. So what's he trying to commentate on? All right, what's his commentary? So again, using visual arts and printmaking in particular to create commentary about society in particular. All right. So Cities on the Move by Romero and also Catlett. I have special reservations. And then also Hiroshige's Light Rain at Shono. These are three very important relief pieces to remember. Now I'm going to jump to intaglio, and intaglio is the reverse. It's the opposite of relief. So there's, again, more great diagrams present in the PowerPoint to let you know. But intaglio is where you're carving into the material, all right? We're going to look at engraving. We're going to look at and dry point in particular. And where you carve into the material, that is where the ink rests. So it's not on the surface anymore. It's wiped away off the surface and it remains inside the grooves. Okay, so special tools are used to make sure it gets in the grooves, and then sponges are used to remove the ink off the surface so it doesn't transfer where it hasn't been cut onto the paper. Right, and again, a roller is used to go over the top to compress the paper down into the grooves to really pick up the ink and create that image transfer. Okay, so again, relief is the ink is on the surface and it's transferred over, and then intaglio is the ink is in the grooves and it's transferred over. Okay, all right. So one thing I want you to pay attention to is your money, your currency, your dollar bills. I mean, they are printmaking process. I think I mentioned this before a while ago. So it's the use of metal plates in particular, and using an engraving technique into the metal plates that burrs into those metal plates to create the design. And the design that you see, again, has to be reversed. So you draw it backwards, okay? You draw it backwards into the metal. The ink goes into those grooves or those gouges that have been carved into the metal. Then the top of the plate is washed away so that there's no ink on the surface. Your cotton, which is what I believe, paper money is made out of, mostly cotton, goes on top. All right, it's compressed through a roller, and then George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Ulysses Grant are all transferred over onto your bills. And then it comes off. The cotton paper comes off of the print, the metal plate, which is the print making tool. It's removed off, and then it's cut down mechanically, and there you go. You have your inflated dollar bills. So that's a professional, federal, universal process. So all your currency that you see on paper or on cotton around the world is a printmaking process using the engraving technique. Right. So one of the first engravers or printmakers is Durer, all right, in 1500s, all right, during the Renaissance, late Renaissance. And this one that we have in our PowerPoint is the Night, Death, and the Devil. And I want you to remember when you're looking at this piece that this is all carved into metal plates, engraved into metal plates. All right, so it's all engraved. And at that time, they didn't have an electrical tool. So everything was done by hand, you know, tapped and chiseled and cut and scraped by hand. And so all that detail that you see is from that engraving technique. And you can see that the knight is facing to the left, and that means that whenever he wanted it presented like that, Dürer had to have it carved where it was facing to the right. Then the image goes, then the paper goes on top, it's transferred over, and he's facing to the left. So all that subtle detail, right, that you see, where you have the dark, like the dark color, like the gray hues and the black hue, the gray and the black, they're gray and black are not hues, they're not colors, remember. Where you see the gray and the black neutrals, that's where he's carved into the plate. Where you see the white neutral, that is where he has not carved into the plate and that he's wiped the ink away. All right. So hopefully that makes sense. And then there's dry point, and it's similar to line engraving. But with dry point, there are burrs. So anytime you carve into the metal, you create a burr, which is like a splinter, like it's displaced, like the metal's been displaced, and it leaves sharp points where that line is being carved. And with dry point, the decision not to etch down or to file down those burrs is what makes it a dry point. So it makes the line quality a little more blurred and not so sharp versus the engraving that we see with Dürer. They're really sharp and precise lines, and all those burrs had to be sanded down or filed down before it ran in through the intaglio press, all right, to transfer onto paper. Versus dry point, and the diagrams in the PowerPoint will show you this, the dry points is those burrs remain, and it allows for the ink to bleed out a little bit beyond the sharp detailed line. So it's a very specific technique to give that sense of smokiness or that sense of blurredness. Again, it's just a play on a characteristic of line. So whenever we were talking about line characteristics, this is where you can see the visual artist is choosing, do I want a sharp, clean line? If I do, I sand down the burr. Or do I want a smoky, kind of blurred line to give a little more characteristic? Then they leave the burr, and that becomes dry point. Okay, so be able to kind of explain the difference between engraving and dry point, which I just discussed. Okay, let's see. I think that might be all I'm going to touch on. I don't want these to be super long. Let's see. One thing I do want you to do is I want you to go in and really focus on the difference between screen printing and stenciling, which I'm sure some of you maybe have done in the past. If you just had a simple image with a stencil that you wanted spray painted onto a t-shirt or something like that, that would be stenciling. But using compression to stencil the paint or the ink over to transfer onto the t-shirt. And screen printing is the act of actually making a screen that would lay over the top of a t-shirt, and then you run the ink through with a squeegee. So look at those two areas. Sorry, I'm sitting on the floor here. But before I stop, I just want to talk about Rembrandt's Christ Preaching, which is an example of the dry point. It's a combination of dry point as well as engraving and etching. Okay, so I didn't talk too much about the etching, but just focus on the engraving and dry point. So where you start to see a lot of the smoky lines and the blurred lines, that's where the dry point is, the burr has remained. And then the details of the figures like the Christ figure as well as others, where the lines are sharper, more detailed, that's the engraving technique where the burrs have been grounded down. All right, so Rembrandt is playing with the characteristics of these different lines and these different printmaking processes in the intaglio fashion to give this certain mood or this ambience to the overall composition, all right, of Christ preaching from 1652. All right. So look at that as an example for dry point as well as engraving. You had Dürer's, the Night and Death and the Devil as a good example of just straight engraving. No dry point, just engraving. Okay. Hope this helps. And I will be sending an email out to you all as well as letting you know when the assessments or the assignments go up onto Blackboard. I'll be posting this PowerPoint very soon. All right. So I hope you all are well. Talk to you soon.